lives near Newcastle with his wife and 3 children, who all have a tolerant understanding of his interest in little green men and flying saucers. I know how they feel. Peter Turner, ladies and gentlemen.
Right, well, the subject of this talk this morning is public funding of mainstream science, a model for ufology, a discussion of possible directions, and that's future directions of ufology, the study of UFOs. And this talk is in part a response to a Mutual UFO Network journal article by Bernard Heisch in the March 1996 edition. I'll just put this up on the screen. The only reason for doing this is just to mention by the by that this journal, maybe some people already contribute towards it, I don't know, but I'd certainly recommend that if you have a keen interest in ufology, that this journal is certainly worth contributing towards. You can't get it through the booksellers, you can't get it through the newspaper agents. It is a subscription journal and you have to get it from the US. Again, by the by, this particular journal, apart from having this article which I'm referring to, also has an extremely good article on the Santilli autopsy film. A very, very thorough article, and it's well worth reading. To put things in context, the Bernard Heisch is a professor of astronomy, professional astronomer, and editor of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. The Journal of Scientific Exploration is in fact a Stanford University publication and is contributed to by recognised scientists. It does deal with subjects which are on the fringe and rarely taken seriously in mainstream science journals such as Nature or any of the more popular journals such as Scientific American or New Scientist. And the message or the burden of the Bernard Heisch article, which by the way is one of the most refreshing articles I've ever seen by a professional scientist on the subject of ufology. It really was a revealing article, this. Is that ufology could well look at the success which astronomy has had and particularly the success which astronomy has had in attracting funding from the public to pursue its research. Now, when I say from the public, of course, it's the public which pay taxes, and it's the government which gives the public dollar away. So it is, in fact, a process of gaining government confidence and support to fund research into astronomy, largely done by the universities and such organisations as NASA. And he's suggesting that maybe ufology could look in the same direction. This is, I think, an extremely optimistic statement, but nevertheless, it's worth pursuing that. And he says they have been successful in obtaining billions of dollars of public funding for research in astronomy for 2 reasons. The first reason being that the public wish to know about the universe and regard the work which NASA is doing as exciting, and in particular this applies to the Hubble telescope pictures, which have certainly been very prominent in the newspapers recently, and the work which they've been doing on the possibility of planetary systems around stars, stars such as Virginis and others. I think there's possibly now 6 stars which have planetary systems around them, and this the public seem to regard as quite exciting, and because they regard it as exciting and interesting, NASA is able to go to the politicians and say, look, what we're doing seems to attract public attention, seems to attract public interest, give us dollars. So in other words, this gives the politicians a mandate to spend the taxpayers' dollar. And the second reason he mentions is that astronomers present a unified professional approach to their subject in the presentation of their results of their research to the public. And he says, without this second factor being present, the first factor will be of no value whatsoever, and it is at this point that ufology hits a roadblock, as there is a complete lack of consensus on any aspect of the subject, and a good deal of very public disputation and unfounded supposition and rumour. Now, it's very well saying that, but of course there are very good reasons why this is so. Ufology is a completely bizarre subject. In fact, if you look at it dispassionately, ufology is really operating right on the very, very fringe of knowledge or scientific knowledge, and this is why we have a situation where we have a lot of disputation, we have a lot of theories, and we have very little evidence, or very little proof of anything. So this is a factor which affects ufology in the public's mind, I think. Nevertheless, it's something which can't be got over just by saying, let's have consensus. That would obviously be nonsense. Bernard Hash also points out that nevertheless there is a great potential for ufology, as according to the polls there is a great inquisitiveness and awareness of ufology, the UFO enigma, and even amongst astronomers there is a majority opinion that the UFO problem at least requires further study. Now he's talking of course in the American context, and he maintains that the polls in the US show that there are 78% no less of astronomers think that ufology deserves at least to be further studied. And this is a truly astounding figure. I don't know whether this would apply in Australia or in Europe, but he's probably getting somewhere near the truth that there is, even amongst scientists in the scientific circles, there is a great deal of potential interest in ufology. And of course there is intense interest amongst the public. This is shown in the rate at which the public watch programs such as X-Files. This has one of the biggest public viewing figures, I think, of any program on television. So there is definitely a very great public interest in UFOs. He goes on, what is needed to fire this potential is credible data presented in a truly scientific format. Now don't forget, he's a scientist, and this is his opinion. Perhaps in journals such as his own, that's a journal on scientific exploration. And he says, even if only evidence of evidence were presented, then this might be the catalyst which would allow reputable scientists to risk their reputation and take a closer look at ufology. Now what he means by this is, I said there are many scientists that we're aware of who take a personal interest in ufology. They don't do it at the sort of public level. They don't advertise the fact that they are interested in UFOs, because if they have a reputation in their particular field of science, particularly in the academic field of scientific research, it will be more than their reputation is worth to announce the fact that they're interested in ufology. So he's saying that if we're going to try and get some scientific interest in our subject, we've got to become more attuned to the scientific method. He noted two other obstacles which are peculiar to ufology and which maybe affect the reputation of ufology amongst scientists and possibly amongst the general public. And he says this is the sheer irrationality of the evidence. Now, what he means by the irrationality, of course, is the irrationality from the scientific point of view. And he gives an example, perhaps the whole scenario of UFO abduction. Obviously, to a scientist, to hear about people disappearing through walls, being taken up in light beams, is just beyond belief. He says that this is a problem. And the second is paranoia. with conspiracy theories. In other words, all this business about government, possible government collusion with the aliens and all this sort of thing, he says is definitely something which puts off the official scientist. And in summary, he says if a scientifically oriented process could be started, science with a big S could be attracted, and following on from this, via political lobbying, there could arise funding opportunities for a full research program. Now, this is all very well. Okay, I can see lots of objections to this. But don't forget, this article by Bernard Hash has been initiated by a mainstream and recognised scientist. He calls himself an insider in mainstream science, and he wields considerable influence in scientific circles via his editorship of a significant journal and with NASA. And of course, it is in the American context that he's speaking. But as I say, a nod is as good as a wink to a blind donkey, and let's assume that we as ufologists are not blind donkeys, and we should heed the hint and seize the moment with both hands. Now, perhaps there is an invitation here. Perhaps he doesn't like to issue a formal invitation, but perhaps there is an invitation here to ufology to try and come out of the cold, as it were, and perhaps join mainstream science, or at least try and get some funding somehow. Don't forget that it was NASA a week or two ago which caused no less than the President of the United States to announce to the world the possibility of primitive life forms on Mars. And I've no doubt that there is something afoot here, and that something is not just an attempt by NASA to take advantage of research effort to gain additional funding, and I don't think it's simply a matter of President Clinton trying to get a bit of publicity for his re-election. I think there's more to it than that. I think there is perhaps an attempt here to bring into public discussion more the fact that there is extraterrestrial life, that there possibly is something to do with the UFO phenomenon. And I think we should possibly take advantage of this moment and do something about it. Now, do we as ufologists really wish for publicly funded research in a truly scientific format? I think I'll not explain exactly what is meant by that, but I suspect everybody knows what I mean. I think there's probably an ambivalence and attitude amongst ufologists to this question. Some feel that the scientific attitude is not capable of explaining or understanding the close encounter type of experience, and by that I mean the abduction experience, the contactee experience, etc., which involve psychic effects, messages, men in black, warnings of ecological disaster, consciousness raising, etc. These are subjects which science is completely dumbfounded by, is completely silent on, and obviously it's not equipped to handle. Others have equally strong feelings that unless the subject is studied scientifically, all the anecdotal recordings and astounding personal accounts of sightings are just so much hot air, which make very good reading, excellent conference material, but ultimately they lead nowhere except to even more outstanding anecdotes. Others may feel, and this is certainly the way I feel, that we as part-time researchers are having too much fun to have the subject taken out of our hands by the professional scientist. In other words, once it gets into the hands of the professional scientists, they will use all their own methods of dealing with these things, and any outsider will be regarded as an amateur, and he will have no part in the process anymore. Of course, this is the usual way which all scientific subjects go. So let's leave this aspect until later in the discussion, where I'll put it in a different context and examine the article, the advantages or otherwise which would accrue to the public funding authorities by expending money on UFO research. Obviously, there's got to be advantage to the public funding authorities with a capital A to give this money away, just as there's obviously advantages to the ufologists. We as researchers have little doubt as to the reality of the UFO, and we also have little doubt that the authorities, whoever they may be, and don't forget this is probably a multifaceted word. When you say authorities, there are many authorities in any one country and of course throughout the world. Whoever they may be are involved in at least a policy of deliberately ignoring the evidence, there's no doubt about that, or at worst a cover-up of the evidence, and possibly, if you take a slightly paranoid view, possibly connivance with it. As we know, sightings and extraterrestrial contacts are being more and more driven into the public consciousness as the frequency of sightings increases and the frequency of close encounters increases. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that this is happening. I think there is a feature too that as more UFO groups become present on the scene, we're obviously getting more and more of the data which this phenomenon presents. Nevertheless, I also think there's, and this is just not my opinion, that there is an increasing frequency of encounters and close encounters. Putting ourselves then in the shoes of the authorities, whoever they may be, this must be a concern to them because the unthinkable may happen at any time. A UFO may land in broad daylight, for example, in Sydney Harbour or on the river here in Brisbane during the lunch break. Any other equally embarrassing scenario may occur, since the phenomena is not within the authorities' control. Now, of course, we assume it's not within the authorities' control. It's possible that some of the sightings we're getting are within the authorities' control simply because they're military vehicles of some type, we don't know. Since the authorities have no control over events, it will be much wiser for them to adopt a more open policy towards the UFO phenomenon. And this appears to be happening. And when I say this appears to be happening, I think it's happening by default. It is happening by default because there are more and more UFO groups present, not just in Australia, but also throughout the world. I should probably detect my accent. I originate from the UK, from the north of England, and the very industrial part of the north of England. And I remember as a kid to think of a UFO group in a particular environment up there would be completely ridiculous. And yet now, in this same area, which admittedly has changed, there are probably 3 or 4 or 5, I don't know exactly how many, UFO groups being formed in that particular area, all very active. And this is happening, as I say, throughout the world. And I don't think any of the government authorities are taking any action to try and curb this increasing interest and this increasing activity on the part of UFO groups. I get the impression that they're quite happy that this happens. Part of this increased openness, which must involve, is going to be done properly, it's got to involve informed public discussion. And this could consist of the encouragement of scientific research, of which there is none in ufology. When I say scientific research, I mean scientific research paid by the government, on account of, and if this happens, if they do encourage scientific research, then obviously there has to be, on account of the expenditure in man-hours and equipment, this would entail public funding. However, before we can get to this stage, there is a high ideological wall to be overcome, not least a wall erected by the scientific establishment. And don't forget, the scientific establishment, again, is a multifaceted establishment. There are people in it who are very interested in ufology privately. There are people who are dead set against it publicly. And the official attitude of official science is that ufology is nonsense. This hesitation to accept new ideas is very well dealt with in Richard Milton's recent book called Forbidden Science, and I certainly recommend it's a good read. An example of this current negative attitude is to subjects like cold fusion, parapsychology, telekinesis, etc. Even when these subjects show very positive research evidence, they're still ignored and denigrated. Just as an example, and by the by, I subscribe to New Scientist, and there's an article in last week's New Scientist called "Lonely Little Earthlings," and this is very typical of the public outrage, so I'll read it out to you. But this is very typical, depressingly typical, I think, of the attitude of official science to subjects like ufology. And it's really referring to the evidence of planetary systems and possibly extraterrestrial life forms on Mars. And the relevant paragraphs here are: why has the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI as it is known in the trade, drawn a blank? Why do we see no extraterrestrial artifacts on Earth, in the solar system, or in the solar system? As Enrico Fermi, who's an atomic scientist, asked, where are they? Quite a astounding statement there. No reference to ufology whatsoever. No reference to the possibility that ufology might have some of the answers. And he goes on, one possibility is that advanced civilizations do not use radio waves for communication. Another is that we have not looked hard enough. I would suggest that's probably the answer there, and certainly have not looked at all. We seem to be left, and the last bit, which is down here, a very depressing conclusion, which seems to be the... Right. Just here. We seem to be left with the article says, we seem to be left with the depressing conclusion that advanced civilizations must be very rare, which is a completely untoward conclusion, I think. There is obviously an ideological component to this refusal to accept new ideas, since acceptance or rejection is very selective. And by that I mean, if you compare some of the very bizarre ideas which are current in orthodox science, such as the many parallel universes explanation of quantum physics, or the instantaneous effect over the width of the known universe of interacting atomic particles. These are completely bizarre ideas. They even seem to go against the current paradigms of science, and yet these are proudly presented to the general public examples of the strangeness which science has uncovered. And my own opinion is that this selectivity reflects political opposition to the very idea of extraterrestrial intelligence being present anywhere near the Earth. This concept of extraterrestrial intelligence out there is given some acceptance by official science, but if the discussion is then extended into what might be happening in the environments of Earth, the extraterrestrial life forms are instantly translated into little green men. And you hear this time and time again on the radio. You talk about, even when they do talk about ufology, it's quite often accompanied by this reference to little green men, with the usual disparaging innuendo that anyone dealing with this possibility is slightly mad, certainly not a scientist, and in any case there is no evidence. This bit about no evidence crops up time and time again, and of course no evidence, what they mean by no evidence is no evidence in a scientific format. The reason for this ideological and political opposition to the idea of extraterrestrial life on Earth is the usual one, that power elites don't like anyone to know that they are not the masters of their own house. The attitude seems to be, keep it quiet, perhaps they'll go away, or perhaps we can come to some sort of deal with them before we're let on to the general population what's really happened. all this is supposition. We don't really know what goes on, and all that we do know with absolute certainty, and I mean absolute certainty, is that there are files of information on UFOs which are classified secret by the various governmental authorities, and they will not come clean on the extent of their knowledge. We know all this because there is, in some countries anyway, a Freedom of Information Act, and through this act it has been possible to gain a certain amount of knowledge of the workings of these governments and how they deal with the subject of ufology. So we do know that there is secrecy involved. As ufologists, what in fact have we achieved? We've collected a very large and astonishing database of sighting reports, some video evidence, photographs, and some physical evidence. The amazing fact is that after 50 years of effort, and that's what it's been, 50 years of effort, we are really no nearer a solution as to what the UFOs really are. We've got stacks of theories. We don't know what they're made of, and most importantly, we don't know what they're here for. Again, we've got stacks of theories, we've got some evidence, we have no conclusions. Going back over the literature, there is periodic reference to the government. Sorry, there is periodic reference to the government appears ready to make an announcement, etc., about what the UFOs are. It never happens. What we in fact left with is the hope, as ufologists, that someday there will be a truly amazing UFO sighting, witnessed in plain daylight by thousands of people, with the press and TV taking pictures. This is probably a remote possibility, and even if it did happen, it would not be any help to ufologists, except we will say, I told you so. It wouldn't be any use to us because it would probably be a one-off happening, and we would still be left with the mystery as to what the dignity are. So what do? We can continue to go on as we have done before, or as we are doing now, or we can look at new directions and new methods of tackling the same phenomenon. I suggest that we seek new directions and organise ourselves along more cooperative lines, making full use of professional and other expertise in our individual research groups. In the past, this hasn't proved very acceptable to UFO researchers, and individuality has been the rule. And of course it still is. In the distant past there has been problems with outside destabilisation, which has been politically motivated. Nevertheless, it has militated against cooperative effort, and in fact it has militated against organisation of UFO groups generally. I don't think this is a feature so much these days at all. There's a need to respond rapidly to high-profile sightings with project groups rather than individual researchers, so that we can rapidly extract the maximum amount of information using greater manpower resources. We're all part-time with limited individual resources, but collectively we can achieve much more than individually. And of course, this applies to any human endeavour in any field. The recent Gosford, New South Wales Central Coast sightings, which Maura McGee talked about yesterday, beginning of 1996, are a good example where a large cooperative project group concept could have worked very well. And of course that has worked reasonably well, but not quite in the context of which I'm thinking, as there are a large number of interviews to be carried out. In this regard, there are a large number of widely separated witnesses, which is not uncommon with a major sighting. The method of the social scientist can be used, provided we have a lot of ufological manpower. In other words, what I'm talking about is properly conducted surveys of a cross-section of the population in using the methods of the social scientists, and such surveys would have great credibility in scientific circles and would in fact be very difficult to refute. In addition, the internet and email are coming into prominence, have come into prominence, and if properly used by and between recognised UFO groups, never mind the questionable gossip and rumour which will no doubt flood onto the net in the future. And I think this is going to be a very major problem. The net is going to be absolutely chock-a-block with all sorts of discussions and rumour and fact and all mixed together. Nevertheless, I think if the UFO groups themselves preserve their own integrity, they will both use the net and it will become a fantastic value in allowing communication between the UFO groups and coordination of joint research efforts. If more cooperative research becomes possible, and it will require a lot of effort to overcome entrenched former practices, the outcome will be a much greater credibility for UFO research because it will be much more thorough, much more penetrating. And I think this is what is needed really to address our subject. We have to seek new directions. If this is combined with an effort to publish the results of research in our specialist journals, UFO journals that is, worldwide, and even in some of the more chatty scientific magazines, such as, I don't think you're necessarily a scientist, but there are a lot of them these days, we will be making progress. And so I see this is the way forward for our subject. Conferences such as this one are a great help. And we are all together as ufologists. We can get to know each other, and hopefully this will lay the groundwork for future cooperative ventures. And incidentally, I think Martin and Timo and his other helpers, who I don't know individually by name, should be congratulated for the enormous effort they put in here, and I think it will bear fruit in the future. Overseas groups such as MUFON, I think that is the journal of MUFON. It is a very large organisation in the States. It has 5,000 members. They are obviously much better organised than we are, and are therefore much more likely to achieve, shall we say, respectability and therefore public funding. But there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why we here in Australia shouldn't aim for and achieve the same success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for those kind words. Any questions for Peter? Question? One at the back first. No, that's you. Peter.
With a lot of people not knowing what UFO and flying saucers mean, what they're here for, besides abductions, I've actually picked up a book about 3 weeks ago, The Diary of UFO Abducted by Kim Colesberg, and in her book she says that when she gets abducted by the Greys, they take her to certain places. One of the places that they apparently took her was a military base in America, and it's got here, it was a 1950s style military base, and she was under the impression that more or less she's been told by the Greys that it's apparent from her experience that apparently the Greys, the aliens, made a pact with the American government asking more or less, can we use your people as breeding purposes in exchange for technology? And she states this in her book. Have you heard anything about this at all? Yes. Apparently it started in the 50s.
Obviously, yes, I've heard a great deal about this phenomena, and I think Carla Turner has written quite a bit about this particular subject. I really don't have any comment on it. It's, I won't say it's completely unsupported by fact, it obviously isn't. There is something there, I've no doubt whatsoever. I think my point is this, that there's an awful lot of theories, there's an awful lot of stuff going around. We're really not getting anywhere just having theories. We've really got to try and substantiate some of these theories. And that's really what I'm getting at.
So I just wanted to say that, getting back to the matter of funding, in the United States, I think every person, man, woman and child in the United States effectively spends something like 80 cents a year on UFO materials, conferences, seminars, magazines, books, that kind of thing. Now in Australia that translates here into a potential of about $14 million a year. Now I don't know about people in Queensland, but I know that we certainly aren't getting our share of that $14 million. So how can we sort of encourage the... You are? Oh, right. How on earth can we encourage the public to put more money into this area, to make it sort of just give it more money generally, which will create more research, more people, and more involvement, more resources, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, the money from ultimately, wherever the money comes from, whether it comes from government or it comes directly from the public, it comes from the public. The money which the government has, it comes from the public. So I guess you've got to look at it maybe in two ways. Is it going to be easier to maybe attract public interest and get money directly from the public, or is it going to be easier to perhaps get some funded research through the universities? I really don't have the answer to that one. I think we should try and get more funding. I think more funding is necessary for UFO research if it is to become successful. I think this is absolutely necessary. As we were discussing in the car on the way here this morning, that is the one thing which is holding ufology back at the moment, is lack of cash to pursue proper research. And I think this is exactly how we achieve this is going to be the subject of some discussion amongst ufologists.
Last question, Mark.
Peter, I'd like to sound a warning, a note of warning about the things you've said today, because I can do so on extremely good authority. Our association, which has existed for about 40 years, has spent probably 30 of those 40 years trying to do exactly what Peter's been saying. I think I might have called you Paul, excuse me. That is to say, they kept saying, let's do the nuts and bolts stuff. We must stay in touch with the scientific community. We need them to pick up this subject and take it on. Right? What happened? Our association failed to keep in touch with the subject. They got left behind. The UFO phenomenon is unfolding faster, much faster than science is evolving. It's not only on the fringes of science, it's on the fringes and beyond the fringes of all human knowledge. Science is just a little dot in the whole thing. And what happened in our case is, when the abduction phenomenon and other things came along, they were so focused on the scientific mentality and in pleasing them and being acceptable to them, they wouldn't have it. For a decade, our association rejected it. Okay, we failed the people who we claimed to be serving because we tried to get the scientists to come on side with us. I say to you, as long as a scientist's reputation is more important to him than the truth, wipe it. Forget them. They'll only go where the money is, and we haven't got the money. It's a plausible notion. It sounds so good. We're dumping work on somebody else who ought to do it better. Forget it. It won't happen that way. I know we need funding. I know we need research progress. I suggest to you that isn't the way to get it.
Yes, I think it's necessary, as I pointed out during the talk, that you have to distinguish between official science and the attitude of individual scientists. And we know that there are many individual scientists who have a great interest in ufology. There is this, as always, the lead taken by the official body which represents scientists is probably way behind the feelings of many of the members of the scientific community. And I think this gives us an opportunity here that we should take advantage of. We should really be trying to interest science in ufology, because I think if we do not do this, if we close our eyes, try to close them out of the subject altogether and say, we're not interested in you guys, we're going to attract a lot of very negative publicity. And I think by taking a more positive attitude towards science, it will enhance our own reputation, and I think it could lead to, somehow or other, I'm not quite sure how, but it could lead to funding becoming available for UFO research.
Thank you, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank Peter Turner.